This is GPS, the Global Public Square. Welcome to all of you in the United States and around the world. I'm Fareed Zakaria, coming to you live. We'll begin today's program with the stunning developments in Russia over the last few days. I'll be joined by top analysts who will help us understand what has happened so far, what might happen next, and what it all means for the war in Ukraine. Also, French President Emmanuel Macron. I talked to him at a global summit he hosted in Paris this week about how the West can help end extreme poverty and curb climate change, and about the striking rise of China and the potential of a thaw in its relations with the US. It's been an extraordinary 48 hours in Russia as the world watched what President Putin called an armed rebellion. The rebel leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was the Kremlin's top caterer before he threw away his kitchen apron. He now wears military fatigues as the head of the shadowy Wagner group, which has provided mercenaries for conflicts in Africa and the Middle East, and most recently has been a key player in Russia's war against Ukraine. According to statements from the Russian government, the criminal case against Prigozhin was dropped yesterday after he agreed to leave Russia and go to Belarus. For more, let me bring in CNN's Matthew Chance in Moscow. Good to have you, Matthew. What is the mood in Moscow?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a great question because, I mean, yesterday the mood was extremely anxious. It was bracing itself, the city was, for a potentially bloody confrontation. Barricades were set up at the entrance points of the city. Not tunnels, but trenches were dug across the main access roads to try and slow the advance of the Wagner armoured column, which was heading decisively towards the outskirts of the Russian capital. It stopped a couple of 100 miles on the outside in the end. But there was a lot of tension that people were sort of bracing themselves for potential bloodshed. Now, that's been averted because of the deal that you referred to. Prigozhin has apparently been sent to Belarus, although I spoke to Belarusian officials this morning and they say they've got no details on what his status is going to be inside the country or whether he has actually arrived yet. But that relief is also, amongst people in Moscow, is also coupled with a high degree of anxiety as well about what comes next, because the idea that this is now going to have a line drawn under it by Vladimir Putin and it's just not going to be mentioned again is totally unrealistic. I mean, this was obviously an unprecedented challenge to Vladimir Putin's authority over the country. He could well now move in the days, in the weeks, in the months ahead to crack down on the supporters of Prigozhin, to tighten laws even further. I mean, who knows what? And that's what the anxiety is all about now, Fareed.
Do you see anything in terms of troop movements in Russia or announcements that would suggest a kind of crackdown has begun? I know Putin has his own presidential guard, which almost is like a Roman emperor's Praetorian Guard. So are you seeing anything that suggests a kind of crackdown?
No, I mean, not at this point. In fact, it's eerily quiet. I mean, in fairness, it's a Sunday today, and so it's not the busiest day of the week. But tomorrow has been declared a holiday in Moscow as well, a non-working day, as they call it here. And that's for security reasons. There are still anti-terrorism measures, as the Moscow authorities have called it, that have been put in place in Moscow. The security measures elsewhere, outside the capital, in other towns that were sort of like Rostov in the south, that were occupied by Prigozhin's mercenary fighters. They've lifted their restrictions now, but Moscow still has them in place. And conspicuous by his absence has been Vladimir Putin. And we haven't seen him in public or on television in any way, except in a pre-recorded interview that was done last week before this crisis happened, since he gave his very angry remarks and his very angry pledge to crack down on what he called this armed rebellion against his authority. We haven't seen him since then, nor have we seen senior figures in the Russian Defense Ministry. And remember, Prigozhin's main motive for marching on Moscow and on the other cities as well was to sort of topple the heads of the defense ministry and the chief of the military staff as well because of the complaints he has against them. They haven't been seen in public at all.
Matthew, thank you. Stay safe. I know it's a tricky business reporting out of Moscow these days. So how should we understand this Russian rebellion? What does it mean for Putin's hold on power? I want to bring in today's terrific panel. Anne Applebaum is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and a staff writer for The Atlantic, and Masha Gessen is a Russian-born staff writer for The New Yorker. Masha, let me first ask you, what's the kind of main conclusion you draw from the events of the last 48 hours?
Well, this is the biggest crisis that the Putin presidency has ever faced. In 23 years in power, he has not faced this kind of challenge to his monopoly on political action and his monopoly on violence. So, it can't be underestimated. Granted, it is a coup that failed, and most coups fail. And another important thing is that Prigozhin never said that he was going up against the president. His march was to the president. He very much sort of maintains this narrative that if the president is doing something that he doesn't support, that the people don't like, the people that he claims to represent, then it's because the president doesn't have the right information. The president himself is beyond assault.
And to me, the most significant thing Prigozhin said is something you allude to in your Atlantic piece, which is he directly and frontally criticized the entire rationale for the war on Ukraine, That seems a major, I mean, this is the guy who's been running the one part of the army that seemed to be winning the battles in Ukraine. And he's saying the war was started on bogus claims.
Yes, this to me was the most extraordinary thing that he said yesterday. He said there were two reasons for the war. One was that the defense minister, Shoigu, wanted to become a marshal. He wanted to raise his rank. And the other reason was that lots of Russian elites had made money from the occupation of eastern Ukraine, from Donbass, since 2014, and now they wanted to make more money. In other words, he was saying this is purely self-interest, this is purely greed, there was no reason to fight this war, and he accompanied that by saying, how badly Russian soldiers had been treated, how many had died unnecessarily. I mean, this was really undermining the entire narrative of the war, and really the entire narrative of the invasion of Ukraine going back to 2014. I think it put him in tune with the Russian army in a way that maybe the Russian military leadership is not, in that, he wasn't talking about imperialism or Peter the Great or some kind of idea about, Russia's special role or Christianity. He was talking about, you aren't giving us enough weapons, you aren't letting us fight. And I think this was the reason why so many soldiers seemed, at least initially, prepared to support him. I mean, to me, the extraordinary moment yesterday was after that comment was when he was sitting in the courtyard in Rostov with the leaders of the Southern Military District, kind of chatting away, and they seemed very happy that he was there, and nobody was trying to arrest him or take him away. So he has some kind of rapport, and he had some kind of, ability to impress the army. I mean, the question now is whether any of that will be retained.
And Anne, do you have a sense as to why it all collapsed so quickly? I mean, at some level, it was kind of weird. He had at most 25,000 troops. Putin's personal presidential guard is, by some counts, 200,000. So it seemed like a kind of mad escapade. What's your sense of why it fizzled out?
I mean, it seemed like a mad escapade from the moment it began, so much so that people, I mean, literally until he was in Rostov with his tanks, nobody really believed that he was going to do it. The only guess I can have is he was, this is a mercenary. He wanted his money. His contract was over July the 1st, and they offered to pay him off. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that maybe he expected more inside support than he got. Maybe he had some expectation of somebody being there in Moscow to welcome him that didn't materialize. But I mean, I really don't think we're going to fully understand yesterday's events for some days or maybe even weeks.
Masha, do you have a sense about this whole issue of the people on the streets in Rostov, for example, seemed to be cheering him on? That seems kind of dangerous. I mean, what conclusion do you draw from that?
So, his main audience is the military and people who are adjacent to the military. And that's exactly who was in Rostov, who was in the streets of Rostov. I wouldn't put too much stock into his undermining the rationale for the war narrative. There are many rationales for the war. Totalitarian propaganda actually works by creating a cacophony. I don't think he's pierced the propaganda bubble. But what he has done is he's tapped into a deep well of resentment, especially within the military, which feels like it's been mistreated, misused, like its bosses are corrupt, which is a fact. And so that, that deep Russian sense of we're being screwed over by our bosses and everybody is corrupt. That's what he's talking to. And that's, I think, why we saw him sort of chatting in a friendly manner with the Deputy Minister of Defense in that Rostov courtyard. And why also he got not, there weren't thousands in the streets in Rostov, but the people who came out to say thank you or to applaud Prigozhin's troops. I also want to say that, every coup is a game of chicken. And I think that he tried to march to Moscow at a certain point. It was probably becoming clear to him that he wasn't going to get to Moscow alive. And that's when he turned around. I don't think there's a whole lot of sort of untangle there. That war of nerves failed.
Masha, and stay with us. When we come back, we will talk about what all this means for the war in Ukraine when we come back. And we are back with Ann Applebaum of The Atlantic and Masha Gessen of The New Yorker. Ann, I wanted to ask you what you think the lesson we should draw about Putin and how to negotiate with him, because it does seem like Putin called Prigozhin a traitor. He called this an armed rebellion. He called this an act of betrayal. He compared it to the Bolshevik Revolution. And then he negotiated with the guy and gave in and gave him, seemingly has given him asylum in Belarus. So to me, it seemed to suggest that when faced with a real, a real threat, Putin climbed down. That one shouldn't worry too much about Putin being willing to climb down in Ukraine and find himself a face-saving excuse, because when confronted with force, he found a way to back down.
Fareed, you're exactly right. There have been a number of moments in the last several years, and also even in the last year and a half, when faced with something stronger, Putin steps back, he retracts, and then he just changes the story and makes up a new one. As you said, in the morning, Prigozhin is a traitor. He's starting a civil war. In the afternoon, we forgive him, and he's moving to Minsk, maybe. We've seen this in a number of other moments. I mean, there was an interesting moment in 2014 when the Russian army tried to, using kind of saboteurs and provocateurs, tried to take more cities in Ukraine. Wherever they were met with force, they stepped down and moved back. And so, we may well have overrated his toughness. We may have overrated, his ability to push things through to the bitter end. I mean, this is somebody who will step back and who can clearly make up new stories if he needs to make them up.
Masha, when you look at the situation, it seems to me at the heart of it is Putin's decision to use a whole bunch of militias in Ukraine. For a variety of reasons, he's not wanted to use the regular army. Initially, because he wanted to pretend that there wasn't an invasion in 2014. in this most recent invasion is because the army wasn't fighting hard enough. And so he gets the Chechens and then he gets the Wagner group. Does this mean that that whole strategy is now going to be disbanded and it's just going to be the Russian regular army, which didn't seem to be fighting very well in Ukraine?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this. One is that he carved up the armed forces, as dictators often do, to make sure that he wasn't at risk of facing a military coup, right? So he always, you've mentioned the Presidential Guard, which could have been marshaled against Prigozhin if Prigozhin had continued his march on Moscow. This is exactly the kind of contingency he was preparing for by creating, in addition to the regular army, various other armed contingents, in addition to creating, as you mentioned, sort of plausible deniability in Africa, in Syria, and in Ukraine. And now the bigger problem that he's facing the strategy of carving up the military has clearly proved dangerous in itself. But also, if Prigozhin's mercenaries are no longer in play in Ukraine, that significantly weakens Russia's military effort at the exact right moment for the Ukrainians while they're staging their counteroffensive. So, I don't know, I can't predict what Putin's strategy on the battlefield is going to be, but I can say with a fair amount of confidence that this is good news for Ukraine.
And we've got about 60 seconds. What are you hearing from Ukraine? You have very good context there. What is the mood there? What is your sense of what's going on there?
I mean, people were sanguine about this. They kept a lot of distance from the events yesterday. People didn't invest too much hope in it. I mean, they know that Prigozhin has also killed a lot of Ukrainians. But generally speaking, the appearance of weakness in Moscow is good for them. It creates doubts in the minds of Russian military commanders, Russian elites, and Russia's allies around the world. And that has to help Ukraine in the short or long term.
And do you think that there's something we should watch for in terms of the counteroffensive now?
I mean, I'm not sure the counteroffensive is going to change, but we should watch for it, and we should continue supporting it, and make sure that they win. I mean, it's the country they're fighting against is one that's decaying and falling apart, and based on a series of lies. And Ukrainian victory would improve that situation.
And in a way, Zelensky made exactly that kind of appeal in a series of tweets that he sent out, saying this shows you that they control nothing. Essentially, they're a paper tiger. Thank you both. Really fascinating set of insights. Appreciate it greatly. Next on GPS, I was in Paris at the end of the week for an interview with French President Emmanuel Macron. He has an important and really important insights into the fight against climate change. And we also talked about the future of US-China relations. All that after the break.